Can a book be so dangerous that it has to be pulled from the shelves and never sold again?
What if it teaches aspiring hitmen and women, presumably and women, how to murder and get away with their crimes?
We're recapping the podcast Hitman.
That's on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time. Hey, Dee.
Yes?
What are you doing right now?
I'm recording a podcast. What are you doing?
I'm getting out my phone and going over to patreon.com. Have you ever been on patreon.com?
I haven't, but if I was to go there, where would you suggest that I go? Patreon.com/what, Jeff?
I would say / so much crime, so little time. In fact, you could do that while you're listening to this podcast right now.
It.
You're doing it?
Mm-hmm.
What are you finding there? You're finding some early released episodes. You're finding some bonus content, some outtakes.
So much crime, so much extra content for only $5 a month?
$5 a month. There is also a free plan, but for $5 a month, you get a whole bunch of fun stuff and you help support us making the show. So if you have your phone, your computer, your iPad, your smart TV, your other device that you may have that's connected to the internet,
your significant other right beside you,
go to patreon.com / so much crime, so little time. Why not do it right now?
Jeff, I just did.
Did you just sign up?
So exciting for me. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start, just a quick warning. This episode is going to have spoilers for the series Hitman. We're going to discuss the whole thing.
If you haven't listened yet, check out our preview episode on this show. It's the one before this one in your feed.
We'll also put a link to Hitman in the show notes, so you can check it out there. All right, before we get into our discussion, we just want to remind you of what this series is. So Hitman came out in 2019. The host is Jasmine Morris. There are 9 episodes, 8 episodes in a coda, and each one is about 30 to 45 minutes long.
So what is the story here? In episode 1, we learned a little bit about the book, Hitman, a technical manual for an independent contractor, and its publisher, Paladin Press. We also heard a recount of the murder of Millie Horne, her 8-year-old son, Trevor, and Trevor's nurse, Janice Saunders. All right, Jeff. Okay, I don't know where to start with this.
Yeah, I've actually was thinking about that as I was listening to it, of where are we going to start talking about this, because this one kind of goes a lot of different places.
Jasmine Morris keeps reiterating, I think, something that Tiffany had said. This is 30, it's not one story, it's 30 stories in one. Jasmine mentioned it numerous times throughout the podcast. Tiffany, as a reminder, is Millie Horne's daughter. She was a teenager, was gone into her first year in college when the murders happened. There's just so much.
Yeah.
I mean, I have so many thoughts where I have a thought of where to go, where I would like to wipe out first.
Where would you like to go first?
Episode 2.
Episode 2 is called Man with a Plan.
This is the Motown episode. Appreciate the context here slightly, but also don't want to hear it. I want it to be 3 lines and I want it to be done. It's possibly my only criticism of the entire format of this podcast.
It's definitely a meandering show. We go on a lot of they're sort of tangents, but a lot of them are directly connected to the story. It's all sort of comes back to this book, as well as to the murder of Millie Horne and her son and her son's nurse. Those are at the center of it.
If you're going down the river or water terminology, it's kind of like all the streams lead to the riverbed. They meander down. But I feel like this could have been an oxbow lake. This could have been cut off and left to die in the corner. I didn't need a full episode on it.
Oxbow Lake, that is that's a deep cut of the geography terms. Yeah, I was thinking that as I was listening to this, because I actually was going to ask you, did you already know all of this, the history of Motown Records, which is what we got here?
No, and no, I'm not saying that I didn't find it interesting, but it felt a little bit too much like we're bigging up this guy who's obviously a prick.
Yeah, Lawrence Horne. I feel like it did a good job of telling us that Lawrence Horne wasn't apparently a pretty big and important guy at Motown Records, and was connected to people like Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross and all these famous huge stars.
So you've just said that in 2 sentences?
It did. Yeah. No, it could have been shorter. Episode 2 didn't need to go into all of Berry Gordy and how the label got started and how it moved to LA.
I don't
Yeah.
want the whole of episode 2. Episode 2 could have been partially like kind of dripped into all other episodes. I feel like Lawrence shouldn't have been given his own episode.
Okay, so is that
In a
less
way
about
where it's like, look how amazing he is. Look who he worked with. Look at his connections. That felt a little bit too, and which was interesting because I feel like the host and the podcast as a whole was so focused on the victims and so respectful. And yet this episode bugged me. I was like, I don't want to listen after this.
Okay. Yeah, if you approach it from that angle, I agree. Yeah, this was the episode that, well, I think this happened with some of the focus on Paladin Press and the people who put out the book too, where it got a little too sort of fascinated with their sort of out there-ness, their weirdness. And yes, they came out looking like horrible men, but it also
But with Paladin Press, I feel like it's at least it's an organization, and I know there was someone in particular kind of leading that organization. But regardless of how much you agree with Paladin Press and how they viewed the books that they were publishing and the manuscripts, whatever they were publishing, as far as we know, none of those people went out and actually organized or did in fact kill someone. Whereas
yeah.
Lawrence Horn has. He's been convicted of this. And I know there's a big conversation in this podcast about the First Amendment, and I think we should get to that conversation.
Yeah.
But that's the fact.
Yeah, no, you're right. I'm
We
not disagreeing with
shouldn't
you.
be leaning into that.
No, I agree. And actually, now I'm looking back at my notes and I realize episode 3 is where we hear more about Lawrence, but we hear more specifically about why he did this. We hear about the inheritance scheme. We hear about the sort of investigation. We hear about how he sort of got found out with his habit of taping everything. And
that's
all.
That's so that was a pivotal part. Like, we needed to hear that. And I feel like this Motown big guy, people thought he was good looking, people thought he was charismatic, all that, put that in like couple of lines within this episode. Do not lean on it because it is not important.
Okay, so we've established that. Episode 2, didn't need it. We're cutting that.
We've established it. Stop talking about it. To move on. Get over it. Okay.
I do want to say before we move entirely off of Lawrence, because he pops up throughout, but he's most prominent in episodes 2 and 3, I think. But in episode, I think it's 4, we hear. So there's also James Perry, who's the guy who actually was the hitman that he hired. In our catalog of dumb moves by criminals, there's a lot of dumb moves here.
I mean, wasn't there a really funny sentence? It must not have been a very good book after all because Barry got caught. Like, I love the way, like, that was brought up as one of the bases. I think in one of the cases against either Paladin Press or the book itself was like, look, it didn't even do a good job. Perry got caught.
Well, okay, so
which
in
is
our
funny, but not funny at all.
Sure. In our preview, we talked about the sort of the stupidity of, okay, so the book says if you get a hotel room, pay in cash, and James Perry paid in cash, but the hotel he paid in cash and required an ID, and he showed his actual ID with his actual name on it, which is the whole reason that they got caught in the first place. Like, if he hadn't done that, they maybe would have gotten away with it. But there's 2 other things that we find out later on that really stuck out at me as like dumb criminal moves. I just want to catalog these dumb criminal moves. One is they were talking to each other by phone because they were different parts of the country. And they were sharing a calling card, which, first of all, I'd forgotten about calling cards. I forgot that was a thing because who's used a calling card in the last 25 years? But I remember them now from the 90s. That was a thing, right? That was the way you made long distance calls, was on a card. And yeah, buy two. Okay, so that was thing number 1. Thing number 2, when Lawrence Horn is being talked to by the police, so he has not been indicted. He does not have to tell them anything. And they ask him if he loved his wife when he married her. Mm-hmm. And he says, no. Just say yes. Just, why would you say, like, that just makes you look so much worse.
Well, can we discuss, was it Perry when Perry was arrested and he was like, I want to call Lawrence? And he called Lawrence and was like, "Hey, I've been arrested." And Lawrence was like, "I'll get you a lawyer." I'm like, guys, you're really not selling us an innocent story here.
I just, you contextualize that against this horrible murder.
Mm-hmm.
And to your earlier point, I do think it's true that this podcast in general kept the appropriate focus on Millie and
Mm-hmm.
Trevor and the nurse as well, Janice Saunders. Like, I appreciated
Mm.
that she made a point of calling out who these people were and humanizing them and keeping them centered. But it's just so frustrating that these guys were so dumb.
Well, yeah, it's kind of annoying that they were so dumb and yet.
And they still did it. Like, that's the thing. Like, be dumb and bungle the crime. Which, like, as we hear about later on, and not to jump around too much, but this is the one in episode 6, we hear about Bobby. This is 1998. This was this woman who was almost killed.
Mm.
So the hitman broke into her home and was trying to murder her. But she ended up having a conversation with him, like
Mm-hmm.
talking to him. And then she ended up escaping and she ended up being okay. But it's just sort of frustrating to listen to. And this is talked about in this series about how a lot of these crimes are so dumb and they're done by people who don't know what they're doing. And obviously, like, no one should ever do anything like this. It's just frustrating to listen to sometimes.
Frustrating to listen to that, like, they're dumb. Absolutely. But also, they killed 3 people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they killed an 8-year-old boy who was completely defenseless.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, his mother and his nurse were both defenseless too, but he was completely defenseless. And it's not one person, it's not rage, it's this planned murder of the 3 of them. I found, was it episode 3 that we heard about Lawrence Horn, like, making sure his 2 daughters, who he, like, loved because, they weren't profoundly disabled,
Yeah.
which that's a whole pit of disgust that, like, seeps into my body when I hear that, make sure they're out of the house because I don't want them impacted. And, like, even the cockiness, the arrogance of him in a meeting with the lawyers when they are trying to fight a case against the hospital where Trevor had been born. And he's like, "Oh no, that's not enough money. I deserve X money and I deserve Y money. And, when I'm driving around in my BMW in Hollywood, he will live through me."
Right. This guy who's a shit dad.
But he's not trying to hide it. Like, he is saying that. Like, he thinks that that's okay to say, or else he thinks he is okay to say it.
Yeah.
It's disgusting. Like, it is vile. He is a vile, was a vile human. And yet, you hear a different side from Tiffany, who, even after all of this, at the end, oh my goodness, that coda
Tiffany.
broke me.
Yeah.
So Tiffany goes to see her dad in prison, and she said as soon as she saw him, he's sick. I think he had cancer.
Yeah.
And she was like, "I couldn't help it. I felt empathy. Like, I felt different feelings when I saw him than when I thought about, throughout the years, how I had thought about him." He still didn't admit it, though.
He didn't admit it. And she also, I think, noted how she had been badly manipulated by him.
Yeah.
And I mean, he used her to get what he wanted. And all these years later, decades later, he was still trying to manipulate her. He was still sick, dying in a wheelchair in prison, and he was still doing the same stuff to her.
Yeah.
That was heartbreaking.
So much of that relationship was just so hurtful.
Yeah.
Him manipulating her into bringing the camera into the house.
Yeah, to sort of
Video
help.
where Trevor...
Yeah, to prepare for the
Stopped.
crime. Let me ask you this. I have a question to step back from this for a second, because I think we're talking mostly about Millie Horn and Trevor Case, which is the one that is sort of the through line throughout this. There is a lot about this book and about the publisher, and we hear a couple of other stories. Like I mentioned Bobby, we also hear about Greg, the 16-year-old who blew himself up seemingly accidentally in his car. These are some of the other stories that funnel into this main story. How do you feel about this overall podcast? Like, this could have been just a podcast about the Millie Horn case and not taking these detours, and not like a significant detour, which we haven't talked about yet, about the book, the publisher,
the author.
the author. What do you think about that?
As in terms of format?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I will say after episode 3, I think it was, when we started to pivot into Paladin Press, my interest levels dipped significantly. Unshockingly, I feel like I need a human connection in order to really feel interested and connected and empathize with the story. And so that dropped off for me. It felt very much like White Boys Club, kind of old White Boys Club. What would you call that? Is that the right phrase to use?
Old Boys Club.
Old Boys Club. And it just felt very, I've heard this, I've seen it before, whatever. I didn't expect the pivot into the author being a woman. I didn't expect the pivot of the author when it went into the author actually wrote the book and first sent the book in to be a novel.
Yeah, work of fiction.
Didn't see that coming, and definitely didn't see it coming that it turns out that the author who sent it in first of all as a work of fiction and then edited it after Paladin Press had said, if you take this eye on it, we can maybe publish this and make it more like it's fact-based, like a how-to book. Didn't see that coming. And I didn't see like the whole Rex Reed thing coming, where it turned out that the author was actually in a relationship with the actual hitman.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, what? Did I get that wrong? Did I miss something?
No, that's right. I mean, he's this sort of mysterious criminal figure.
I hate that for him. I hate that he has that.
Yeah, he seems like a real bad guy.
I mean, yeah, but also like mysterious criminal figure makes it sound somewhat movie appealing kind of way.
Well, but he's also does some real dumb stuff, right? Like his seemingly go-to move was to rip off drug dealers and pretend to be a cop, which he did successfully for a while, but as happens, he eventually takes it too far and screws it up. Yeah, no, I'm with you. All of that was seemingly out of left field, but I also, to your earlier point, I also definitely, like, my connection to the story dropped off pretty precipitously when we were talking about the book, which is weird because when you told me we were going to listen to this podcast, I thought, oh, it's a story about this book and how this book came to be. And I thought, that's different.
Books. Yeah.
I do love books. But that was maybe my least favorite part of this whole thing.
I actually found it quite interesting. Like, I think they played with it in a good way. I feel like they formatted it in a very deliberate manner. So victims first, victim focused story first, bring back in the book, and then they bring it back to the victims at the end. I felt like that was like formatted quite well at the start. I think in episode 1, and I think when we were introduced to the book a little bit more in maybe episode 4, but throughout the first half of the series, we hear excerpts from the book and they're all read in a male voice. And then after the bombshell is dropped that it's actually a female that wrote the book, we start to hear it from a female perspective. And then when we hear that it was supposed to be written as fiction, I feel like the style of the narrator of the book changes as well. And I thought that was like an interesting way of developing and saying, like, depending on who or like who's reading it or how they are reading it, the listener or the reader is going to take on a different meaning of the book. Yeah. It's like how someone texts. Like, you can never read someone's feeling or someone's thoughts or the intonation of someone's voice through the text. Like, right. You have to hear them say it. It's very easy to read off it what you want to read off it as opposed to what they're giving you. I don't know that I noticed that, but that is, like, in hindsight, yeah, that was definitely there. The moment where it got into about how this was originally supposed to be a fiction book, and then the publisher was like, well, we don't do that, but just basically you just tweak it a little, call it nonfiction. And so did that change? Because like in the preview episode, you and I had kind of different views on whether this book should be allowed to exist. I very much said the book didn't go out and kill someone. As the podcast went on, did that get tested a bit? Absolutely. But if we're just looking at it from this perspective of how you see something going from a work of fiction to like a how-to manual, did your perception of the really thin veil that exists between the two, if we flip it, say we heard a story of someone sending in a manual, a how-to book, and the publisher says, we cannot publish that right now. It's not happening. But if you work it, if you change it slightly into like a work of fiction and you just soften the tone slightly, would you be maybe change the cover, maybe change the title? We might be able to pass it as a, I don't know, satirical maybe? Is that the right word that you would use for it?
Yeah.
Like,
but
work of fiction. Like, if we worked at it that way, do we have an issue with it? We don't, but we have an issue with it going the other way. Like, it's such a thin line in this case of what we think is acceptable in free speech and what we think is not.
No, it's true. And I think I had complicated feelings about this. And I definitely was on the side of this book shouldn't be published when we talked about this in the preview. And then I think you argued strongly against that. And I think I came around to seeing your point of view. And I was thinking about that as I was listening to this. And as I was listening to the lawyers talk about the court case and how they basically got this book pulled from the shelves and just how much of an uphill battle that was. And I was thinking throughout that of like, is this the right thing to do? I don't know. It's hard to say. Like, I feel like this really came down to not the content of the book, not necessarily the First Amendment, but in this specific case, this specific book, these specific crimes, and how this book was used. And it almost to me seemed very much like a localized story rather than like something you could extrapolate like a legal precedent out of.
I think what is hard is when you're coming at that from where we are now. We've discussed this previously, how we're like, wow, I never took the perspective of time into an account. I can't remember what story it was. Maybe it was something to do with not having a mobile phone at the time. I can't remember which podcast it was. But for me, one of the most pivotal moments when we're talking about the publishing of the books and the publisher in general, Paladin Press in general in this podcast, was when they said, we won the case just as the internet started to take off.
Right.
So
yes.
All of a sudden the book is now available on the internet. Like, this information has already been made available. So even if you were to get all the books that were ever published back off it, it's now there. And as we know, when something goes on the internet, it's there. It's there forever. And I think it's hard coming from a place of having grown up with the internet for the majority of my life, that we cannot blame the information for the human acts.
You can't. You're right. But at the same time, there is certainly an immoral and irresponsible element to what these publishers were doing.
Yeah. Do you think that Lawrence Horn would have found a way for these murders to happen had the book not made its way into his life?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Probably. But did the
Definitely.
book facilitate it? Did the book make it easier, more successful?
But this is where we're going into it. We've discussed this before. If he looked at an episode of Murder, She Wrote or CSI, like, he's gonna see this.
No, you're right. You're right. And I also, so there's two parts to this. I feel like there is, if you were Paladin Press, if you were a publishing company and someone came to you with a book like this, would you publish it?
Are we at the stage of it's a work of fiction, or are we at the stage that it's a work of nonfiction?
Nonfiction. You're a nonfiction publisher and someone brings you a nonfiction book about how to be a hitman and how to get away with it, how to do it, how to murder people, and how to cover your tracks.
I don't think you can answer that question. I mean, I can sit here and say, absolutely not. I wouldn't do that because I know the impact that this book has had. I don't mean to go high pitch, and that makes it sound like I'm completely dismissing this whole thing. I'm not dismissing it. I'm not dismissing these murders. Lawrence Horn and James Perry, absolute vile. Lawrence Horn in particular, I think he was a vile, disgusting human. I just believe that he would have been a vile and disgusting human whether this book existed or it didn't. And I understand the case is made and it's put forward within the podcast, all of these different events that apparently came from this book. And it's shocking when you see how many came from it. But coming from a place of now with the internet the way it is now, is it shocking that anyone can get any information from the internet? Like, that's not too shocking.
It's not. But does that mean you want to go out there and be another Mark Zuckerberg or another Elon Musk just putting garbage out there for people? And
well, that's a good point. Well, then I will say it's not a high horse kind of situation. It's a, yeah, if I'm a publisher who's saying I want to put out quality information that is helpful to people, if that is my guise as a publisher, and if that is the point of the publishing company, yes, of course I'm going to say no to that book, because that's not providing anything for the people. But if you think, wow, this book is really interesting, it's going to really take off because it's such a novel idea or whatever, maybe you have a different guise of it. I don't think I can answer that as in, would I as a person.
So that's the one side of this that I wanted to explore, is if you were in their shoes, like, would you have qualms about this? And it sounds like you would. You wouldn't want to be someone who this was the book that made your fortune. Okay. So the other side of it is the First Amendment side. And should this be allowed? Should this be legal? And that's a very different question, I think. It's one thing to say, I would want to profit from this, or I would not feel comfortable profiting from this, which is a question I think a lot of people ask about, like the companies they work for, the type of business they're in. Do they feel good about it? Mm-hmm. Do they feel like the product, this is you can work for an oil company, you can work for a cigarette manufacturer, you can work for whatever, a drug company, and you can look at different sides of that, of, do I feel like the company I'm working for is doing good in the world or evil in the world? And what's my role in that? What's my culpability in that? But then the other side of it is, should this be legal to do? And the podcast gets more into that side of it. It gets into both, but it
legal to publish the information.
Yeah. The First Amendment side of it.
See, this is the side I struggle with, because like we've seen in recent times how people are trying to restrict the access for the public, for teenagers, for school-age kids to get access to certain novels.
But that's not the same thing. That's not the same thing.
But it is.
No.
No. But how isn't it? And you know exactly where my thoughts lie on both of these sides. You know exactly how I feel about these things. But how is it not the same? Like, you cannot say it is totally fair for you to take this book off the shelves. And this is what the librarians were up in arms about. In this podcast, it was noted the librarians were unhappy that a case was being taken against the publisher to get this off the shelves. If you are going to censor people from having this information.
No, I understand the legal argument, and I understand the librarian's perspective, and I respect that side, that point of view, 100%. I do. I think at somewhere you draw the line between freedom of speech and the First Amendment and something that is causing harm in the world. And it's not a free-for-all.
But who?
Free speech is not unlimited. It's not unlimited. You cannot say or publish or put out in the world anything.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying they chose to publish this. This went to shelves. To pull it, where...
This is where the line is. This, to me, is where the line is.
This book is.
This book led to the murder of these 3 people, maybe a bunch others that we don't know about.
You see, though, did it?
Yes, it did. It did.
How did it? I don't believe that it did. And that is my point. Do I believe that this book should have been published? No, I don't believe it should have been published. I don't know why anyone wants to know this information. But I do not believe that it led to these murders. I believe that the people who took this information, who used it to plan over weeks or months the murder of other people, that is what led to it.
I don't think that these 2 people in this particular case were necessarily smart enough to commit this murder. And this book, because I believe people learn things from books. Books are educational.
You say I believe as if I don't believe
I'm
that.
implying that you're saying...
I don't like education.
They would have done it without the book.
I do believe they would have done it without the book.
I think they would have tried.
Yes.
But I think the book made it easier for them. And I think that responsibility, despite what the publisher, what Paladin Press says, that responsibility is with the publisher. They made murdering this woman, her son, and her son's nurse easier.
You see, you say that, and that makes it really hard for me to like have a disagreement with you, because it makes me sound cold and that I don't care. And like, my heart broke for these people. This should have never happened. As I said, Lawrence Horn was a vile person. Trevor, Millie, and Janice should never have been in that position. And Millie had known. She knew that feeling was in her that this was going to happen. I believe that they would have tried, and they would have been somewhat successful if they had tried, regardless of this book. I do believe that. I know you don't, but I do believe it. I feel like a book cannot sway you into being that evil.
No, but it can teach you how to do it.
But like, it wasn't even that good. It was like, don't use your identity when checking into a motel. Don't use your credit card. Put a silencer on the gun, because if it's silent, you get a bit longer to get away. Don't.
Okay, let me approach this from a different angle.
None of the information was like mind-blowing. This is so clever.
We have talked before on this show about some of the things we have learned about murder that I, for one, didn't learn from Murder, She Wrote. Some of the real gritty details of...
The hand slipping on a knife.
That's a great example.
Yeah. But you don't watch that much crime dramas. I knew that already.
Okay. I recognize that that information is out there in fiction all over the place. It definitely is.
Name one thing that the book mentioned that you should do that you never were like, that you were like, whoa, I never would have thought of that.
Well, I haven't read the book. I don't know all that.
No, but name something in the podcast that was brought up that you were like, whoa, I never knew this.
I mean, it taught you how to build a silencer from regular parts you can get at a hardware store. I don't know how silencers work. I thought a silencer was a thing you buy at a gun store. I remember in The Godfather Part 2, pillow. They use a pillow as a silencer.
Okay.
Does that really work? I don't know. It's in The Godfather Part 2. I'm glad you got that so quickly. That was impressive.
I'm telling you, I know a lot about this.
I learned a fair number of things about murder from The Godfather.
Mm-hmm. When was The Godfather released?
70s.
This is my point. This is a work of fiction that got turned into a work of nonfiction. The line between the two was a sliver. If this had been a work of fiction and it was published as a work of fiction, I don't think we'd be having this conversation.
No, that's true. That's absolutely true.
Because even if the work of fiction was taken and the murder was committed off of some of the things that were known from it, I just don't think there would be as much of a it's the book's fault situation. Wasn't Stephen King brought into this podcast at one stage to say
he was, yeah,
how one of his books was used in
a crime and he felt awful about it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But and just to clarify, the author who went along with the pen name Rex Farrell, we never hear the real author's name, even though Jasmine Morris did apparently find it out. The author wanted to pull the book after these murders. So, the author felt bad. So the author didn't go in saying, this is what I want to happen. I don't agree with Paladin Press's morals or ethics with what they were trying to do, but I'm just saying I don't think we can stand here and say this information cannot be out there. I don't think we should be censoring that level. I just don't.
All right, so you come down on the side of the murders of children and women. I understand. Okay.
I think we should have recorded Faces video for this episode if that's what you were going to say.
I did want to ask you.
I don't like what you said, and I feel like I've come across as if I am on the side.
You're on the side of the librarians and free speech.
Yes, not necessarily this book and not necessarily the content of Paladin Press. That's not what I'm about. I'm just saying the line is so thin, and if you say, let's ban this book, what do people feel like they have the ability to ban? Because if I have a strong religious belief, or if I have a strong whatever belief against X, Y, or Z, is it fine for me to say, I feel like in my community or in my library, I'm not going to have these things?
Do you think I sound like I'm on the side of book bans?
Dangerous. Pardon me?
Do I sound like I'm on the side of book bans? Because I am not on the side of book bans.
I'm aware you're not on the side of book bans. I'm just saying it's very easy to say we should ban this book. Oh, but not every other book. And my point is going down the road to banning books and banning information is very slippery and it's very dangerous. I do not agree with the content of this book. I do not agree with how it was used. But I do agree with the librarians who were like, this is dangerous. This is not a good way to approach things. Educating people in a positive way is how you go about ensuring that that's what you do. You don't remove content. You give people education. You give people context.
If I had a book that I wanted to publish, nonfiction book, that had your home address in it, a diagram of your home, where everyone in your home, your family, sleeps, and instructions on how to murder them and get away with it. And I said, First Amendment, I can publish this book.
No.
You would agree that shouldn't be published.
But that's so unfair. I feel like that is such a leap.
Is it?
Yeah.
These men learned how to do that crime from this book. This book taught them how to murder these women and children.
This book did not put a diagram of the house that they were sleeping in it.
No.
They did not do that. I understand what you're getting at, but I think it's unfair how you're portraying it. I think it is an unfair road to go down. You are meandering down towards the Oxbow Lake, Jeff, and I'm going to cut you off.
Okay. You would agree, though, that there are certain things that should not be published in a book.
100%. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if we start banning books, I think it's a slippery slope, and I'm on the side of...
We do ban books. There are certain things that we do not allow to be published. There is certain content that is deemed so offensive or so immoral or so dangerous that we do not publish it.
We don't publish like opinion or fact books, or we don't publish like fiction books. So were we not only talking about
books.
We were
non-fiction.
talking about
Yeah.
My point is, I think we have to look at the line of how fiction and non-fiction, in this case, it's so very close.
It is
Tweak
close.
a few bits and you make it fiction, or you make it non-fiction.
Sure. I'm saying that, to me, this book falls on that side of actual dangerous, causing harm material. We should just agree that I don't feel like we're totally disagreeing here. I think we're on a little bit on different page with this.
Are you recommending this to a friend?
I think I would recommend this to people. I think, to your point from the beginning, there are parts of it that I don't think needed to be there, but I think the majority of it helped serve the story, and I appreciate how it began and ended with this story and was kind of woven throughout about Millie, about Trevor, and about Janice. I did appreciate that. What do you think?
I have actually spoken to people already about this podcast being like, it's not a format that we have listened to before. It's a very unique story where we're bringing together like one main case, one main murder or triple homicide, with a book, with a publisher, with a few other deaths and killings and attempted murders, with also this thread going through it of a father who doesn't respect all of his children equally, with a divisive, like a divorce, with Motown. There's just so many aspects. It felt in a way like it could be a fiction novel in itself.
Yeah. All right. That's our take on Hitman.
All right. Jeff, we are about to introduce the next story that we're going to look at on this show. But, I think sometimes it's a really good idea to take a few deep breaths, take a step back before we introduce a new show. What could we do for a minute, 2 minutes before we jump into a new show? If you were a listener and you need to take a moment to absorb what we have just put forward, the discussion we have had, consider their thoughts and their points of view before we say what we're going to listen to next, what would you advise them to do in that spare time?
I mean, maybe go get a beer, or maybe go for a walk, or maybe if you've already done those things, go to patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time. Like, whatever you're doing right now, as you're listening to this, you have your phone. I know it's nearby. It's got to be nearby, right?
It's got to be nearby.
patreon.com/so-much-crime solo time. You can scroll through and see the types of things that we've posted and how excited you are to listen to those things. And there's little clips that you can preview without even signing up, but you're going to love it so much that you're going to want to sign up for $5 a month. Support the show. Get access to all of this additional content, to episodes that come out early, and all the fun outtakes. Patreon.com/so-much-crime solo time. And Dee, if they've already done that,
maybe they could rate us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends, tell your frenemies, tell your parents, tell not your kids under 18. Tell everyone. Share the good news. Share the good news. So Much Crime, So Little Time is here, making sure you don't have to look for your own next true crime story. We're bringing it forward to you.
So Dee, it's almost Thanksgiving. What if for Thanksgiving we talk about dueling podcasts about murder? In honor of Thanksgiving, we're going to talk about a crime that happened on Thanksgiving back in 1991. Dee, have you ever heard of Omaima Nelson?
No.
Okay. Omaima Nelson was an Egyptian-born former model. In October of 1991, she met a much older man, and almost immediately they got married. And then Thanksgiving of 1991, so this is November, the next month, she murders him. This is a story that involves bondage, castration, possibly cannibalism, all the things of a horrific holiday story.
So you can listen to us as you prepare your appetite for that Thanksgiving turkey.
So this is a story. This is a story that's been covered by multiple podcasts. And so we're going to use this story as a way to check out two podcasts that we have not talked about before and do a crime battle. So we're going to listen to the same story, one episode per podcast, and decide who covered it better. Our contenders are, first up, a show called Black True Crime Podcast, hosted by Kayla and Kristen. The other one, Sisters Who Kill, hosted by Marah and Taz.
Ooh, yeah, I'm into this. This is going to be interesting.
So, just to be clear, the Sisters Who Kill episode came out on November 27th, 2021. Black True Crime Podcast was episode 83. It came out on September 2022. If you go to either one of their feeds and search for Omaima Nelson, you will be able to find it. We'll also include a link in our show notes for these episodes.
That's on the next So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.